After the church was adopted by the Roman Empire, the heathen practice or heresy was adopted, and the practice is recorded by Epiphanes. By the medieval period, up to the close of the Council of Trent in 1563, we see that Mary had been elevated in the liturgy, being mentioned by name now as the Most Holy, the Stainless, the Blessed, Our Mother, Our Lady, Mother of God, and so on. So she's back. But Aleister Crowley said that for some reason best known to themselves, the translators of the Bible have carefully crowded out of existence and smothered up every reference to the fact that deity is both masculine and feminine. They have translated a feminine plural by masculine singular in the case of the word Elohim. So even though the word for God that was known throughout the whole of the world is feminine, we can just change that. We'll just masculinize it. Doesn't matter what anybody thinks. We're in business here. We've got the control of the human mind to think about. We don't care about the rules of grammar or language. He says that woman is equal to man. Okay, the great magician here is saying that woman is equal with man and certainly not inferior to him, as it has been persistent endeavor of so-called Christians to make her. That's right. In the magical tradition, such nonsense holds no currency. Erich Neumann, the German psychologist and historian, in his book The Great Mother says, although Christianity did its best to suppress it, this matriarchal symbolism has survived, and not only in the cup of the Last Supper or in the mythical Grail, the plunge bath became in Christianity the baptismal bath of transformation, that is a return to the primordial egg of the beginning. Alvin Boyd Kuhn says, under the psychological influences of this persuasion, religion in this system was so overbalanced by the unmitigated overemphasis on the functional cult of the spirit and the corresponding militant negation of the physical and the natural, that Christian devotion was warped into forms of morbidity and corruption. The psychological consequences of this distortion became so patent in the history of the church that a rectification of the imbalance was perforce dictated by polity, and the Holy Mother was restored as the fourth member of the divine quaternity, as the Blessed Virgin or the Mother of God. Okay, so now God has a mother. The Son of the Mother thus became the Salvator Macrocosmi, the Savior of the world, by virtue of his uniting in himself the mundane, orthonic, unconscious lower potencies in polarity with the superior conscious divine powers. So Mary is reintroduced, and she's the Mother of God. But right there you have a problem, because many thousands of years before, the Egyptians had a Mother of God. Nuth, Isis, Hathor, Mat, Taut. Aleister Crowley, in his masterpiece, Magic in Theory and Practice, says that it is therefore incumbent upon the male magician to cultivate those female virtues in which he is deficient. It will then be lawful for a magician to invoke Isis and identify himself with her. If he fails to do this, his apprehension of the universe when he attains samadhi will lack the conception of maternity. The result will be a metaphysical and, by corollary, ethical limitation in the religion which he founds. Judaism and Islam are striking examples of this failure. Now, he's not endorsing the perverted types of things that people are getting into today. He's not talking about cross-dressing, transvestitism, or any of that. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, and nor am I saying there's anything wrong with that if that's your means of getting in touch with the feminine. Hey, something's better than nothing, right? What I am saying is that those perversions are coming about because of the original suppression of the truth. If your mind and your heart and your soul is screaming for bipolarity, but we have no rites and rituals to help you to do that, then naturally your mind will find perverse ways of doing it. That's what the word perverse means. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just that what's wrong is that you were suppressed in the first place. You were left in the dark and waylaid originally. But what the high magicians are talking about is more than that. They're talking about a systematic and reverent identification with the feminine principles, not in another, but in yourself, for whatever that might mean. And you can't know ahead of time what that will mean. For some it'll be a little bit more, for some it'll be a little bit less. For some it'll be an intellectual process, for others it may take on some sort of physical component. You don't know ahead of time. Nobody is there to teach you this or tell you this. It's purely your own. Now if we turn to the Kabbalah, which is another one of the pages of the great Western magical tradition, and we turn to the tree of life and the fourfold nature of man, we have to clear up another piece of disinformation, and that is who originated the Kabbalistic system and the tree of life. Now, the Kabbalistic system is frequently touted to be the creation of the Hebrews. Though the Jews preserved the figure and philosophy of the Kabbalah, they are not its creators. Judeo-Christianity had a strict prohibition against graven images, remember. This prohibition is second in the Mosaic commandments and means that the Jews cannot lay claim to what is obviously an extremely elaborate symbolic treatise. The Kabbalah is again purely Egyptian in origin. As Helena Blavatsky says, according to Sir W. Jones and other Orientalists, the oldest discoverable languages of Persia are the Chaldaic and Sanskrit, and there is not a trace of Hebrew in these. It would be very surprising if there were, since the Hebrew known to the philologists does not date earlier than 500 BC, and its characters belong to a far later period still. What we know as the Hebrew language didn't fully come into effect, didn't get polished until the captivity in Babylon and then the sojourn in Greece. This is perfectly understood by scholars. When we look specifically at the Kabbalah, what is the Kabbalah? What is the tree of life? We find that it's a tree that has 10 zones, 10 circles, 10 regions of energy, and 22 intersecting paths. But most importantly is that the tree is divided horizontally into 4 levels or 4 regions, all corresponding to the elements. They have Hebrew names, Atziluth, Bria, Yetzirah, and Asaya, but they just represent fire, water, air, and earth. And the Kabbalah, the word alone tells you that it's Egyptian because the Egyptian had 3 parts of the soul. The Egyptians did not have one soul. The Egyptians had multiplicities of souls. When you have the dark part of you, and the happy part of you, and the light part of you, and the secret part of you, and the Errol Flynn type part of you, and all of these different aspects of yourself that you have, the fear part of you, we just think of those as parts of a single personality. You know, you have a criminal part of you. You have a very spiritual side of you. You have a childlike side of you. All of these different sides of you. Well, they did not think of it as being all of these sides as of one central personality. They literally thought of that as separate souls into which your whole energy could pour. So theoretically, you could become manifested with that very, very childlike part of you permanently. It was your choice. But in their sacred tradition, the soul was of 3 levels. And those levels, believe it or not, were actually called the Ka, the Ba, and the Allah, or the La. So Kabbalah, the word, is actually Egyptian for the 3 parts of the soul. And the tree of life was often shown with a serpent coiling around it, and ancient scholars knew that Egypt was called the land of the tree and the serpent. The book of Genesis story, by the way, of the tree and the serpent is codified in Egypt. We know that the Kabbalah is Egyptian because those 10 zones I was talking about, in Hebrew they're called Sephirah. Sephirah is where we get our word sphere from. They're just spheres of energy, realms of consciousness. Of course, this thing relates to the inner states, the inner psychological states. But each of the gods, and there were 11 in all, and there was an Ennead. The Egyptians had their famous Ennead, which is 9 gods. So of the 9, 10, 11 major deities, there's one for each of the zones on the tree of life. And originally, these deities were perfectly assigned to the tree of life. Those 4 regions on the tree of life have correspondences to the tarot cards. The wands, the cups, the swords, and the discs are the 4 zones: fire, water, air, and earth. In the tarot cards, just like in regular playing cards, the deck is divided into 4 suits called the wands, the cups, the swords, and the discs. The wands is like your clubs, the cups is hearts, the swords relates to the spades, and the discs would be the diamonds in a regular playing cards. But in esoteric tradition, they go along with the Kabbalistic 4 realms. Now Jesus dying on the cross of 4, above his head, we often see this term INRI, INRI, and it's put before us that means the King of the Jews. But nobody really has a decent translation of it, and the biblical concordances and biblical dictionaries say that the jury's out, they don't know really what it means. Well, again, it's not that hard to decipher. The INRI are well known in the occult tradition. Those are the 4 letters representing the 4 elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And it's the same in Latin or in Hebrew. If you fire, water, air, and earth in Latin or Hebrew, the letters are INRI at the beginning of the words. So Jesus is now dying to what? To the 4 elements. He's transcending the 4. Now, Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky says that the crucifix, as we know it, the crucifix of Jesus, was an instrument of torture and utterly common among Romans, as it was unknown amongst Semitic nations. It is certainly not the Christian cross that John had in mind when speaking of the signet of the living God. So she's refuting the idea that the crucifix is not the cross. Okay, when the Christian fathers were talking about the cross as the symbol of Christianity, it was not to the crucifix that they were originally referring. Interestingly, when we go back to the very first dynasty of the first cult of Egypt, the very first god, I mean that's the first god of the first dynasty of Egypt, his name is Atum, A-T-U-M. But in numerology, those letters are 1, 2, 3, and 4. The androgynous Atum was personified by the pharaoh who is seated on the cubic throne with arms crossed in a quaternity. Jesus hangs on the cross in a quaternity. Pharaoh sits on the cube with his hands crossed in front of him like this. So whether your arms are like this as a 4-fold entity, or whether they're like that as a 4-fold entity, the mythos is the same. The symbolic message is the same. You are a quaternity. You are a 4-fold individual. Now, Atum, A-T-U-M, is the same thing as the Hindu Atman, or the soul, but the Jews picked up on this, the Hebrews, and they made it Atum, or Adum, or Adam. And the word Adam in numerology is 1414, which also makes 10. So, Atum, 1, 2, 3, and 4, of course, if you add the digits 1, 2, 3, and 4, it makes 10. So, Atum, the first god of the first dynasty of Egypt, is completion. He's total man, number 10. 10 has always been a symbol for completion, Adam, Kadmon. Adam is 1414, slightly different numerology, but in fact, it also equals 10. And you can always remember that because that's how your hands are. A thumb and 4 fingers, a thumb and 4 fingers. 1, 4, 1, 4 is Adam, man. So when you see the Christ on the cross, or with the cross as a symbol beside him or behind him, and you see the Pharaoh with his arms crossed in front of him, please understand that it's the same story that is being told. The story of the enlightened, androgynous, saintly man who is on the path of self-realization, who is transcending the 4, the limitations of the 4. Same thing in India. Same thing in India, when you have the one man with 4 arms. Same thing when you have the geometry of the 4 points of the mandalas. Same idea in the ancient Vedic swastika, which originally also had to do with this, of polarities coming together, magnetic polarities coming together. Same idea in the tree of life, originally an Egyptian motif that shows you 4 striations, 4 levels, a tree with 4 divisions. In the Tarot, this is one of the most important of all motifs. As I show in my classes on the Tarot, this quartering motif is hidden or secreted into the imagery. You often see many of the figures in positions that demarcate the triangle and especially the squaring or the quartering. So we don't have time in this program to go into all the meanings of it, but just for now, notice that there on the left in the center of the High Priestess's chest, you have the cross. In the Wheel of Fortune, there's the cross, and there's the 4 evangelist symbols on the corners of the card. And on the right-hand side, again, Lady Universe is dancing in what they call the dance of Shiva, with her leg crossed at the knee point. Why is this imagery there? And also she, on that card, has the 4 symbols of the compass points around her. And in the Emperor card, we also see that figure. To what is this referring? Here again, on the card for Sagittarius, number 14, we have a square in the middle and the triangle. In Judgment, card number 20, we have the square. You only have to look at a Christian art and you'll see the quartering motif, the square being used a lot. Here in Celtic mythology, here's the saint in the middle, and on either side of him you have the square of the cross. We just think it's all artwork and never paid any attention. In Egypt we have the idea of Horus, yes, the sun god, but he has 4 suns. And those 4 suns are well known to represent the 4 corners. But could they also not represent the 4 aspects of human consciousness? The 4 types? The Kabbalah tree of life, as we said, was divided into 4. And then those 10 circles of energy were arranged from that point on. This was a mystery that was kept in Egypt, the land of the tree and the serpent. Sometimes we'll even see the serpent itself with 4 undulations. Now, before we leave the Kabbalah, there's another interesting thing to bring out about it. I didn't mention the 3 bars or the 3 paths. If you actually look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, you'll notice that it's also made up of 3 vertical poles, one on the left, one on the middle, and one on the right. These 3 staffs or poles or ascents are very interesting as well, especially the one in the middle, which is called the pillar of equilibrium. In Kabbalah, if you study this and get a book on Kabbalah and look at the tarot cards that are associated with the central pillar on the tree of life. Okay, so if you've never been into this subject before, just go and browse a book on the Kabbalah. You can get books on it. And tarot cards are assigned to those 22 paths. But if you look at all the cards of the central path, which is known as the pillar of equilibrium, the pillar of balance, every single card is a feminine card. So the straight road from ignorance to enlightenment, from earth to heaven, the straight road has only feminine tarot cards associated with it. Because she was the keeper of the mysteries. In card number 2, we even see the Kabbalah symbol, but in a different type of design. The high priestess sitting between the 2 pillars, but she is literally the middle pillar. And behind her is the pomegranate tree. The pomegranate tree was sacred to Persephone, the goddess of the underworld. The idea being that you're going to have to go into the underworld and through the unconscious in order to be enlightened. You must pass through your own shadow, and then you come to the tree of everlasting knowledge. The fruit of the tree of life is hidden behind the female principle, the Sophic principle. That was also known as the path of the arrow. But the path of the serpent is also a term that is given to the tree of life. And of course, we understand that the serpent and the female are connected in the program astrotheology. We even saw that in Egypt, when you wanted to write the word woman, you drew a serpent. The hieroglyphic serpent indicated the female. Joseph Campbell says that Jane Ellen Harrison, the historian, demonstrated over half a century ago that the field festivals and mystery cults of Greece, numerous vestiges survived of a pre-Homeric mythology in which the place of honor was held not by the male gods of the sunny Olympic pantheon, but by a goddess, darkly ominous, who might appear as 1, 2, 3, or many, and was the mother of both the living and the dead. And her consort was typically in serpent form. Any of you who've read my book on Atlantis, Atlantis Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, will know much more about the relationship between the female and the serpent. Now, Joseph Campbell in Occidental mythology says that in Eve's scene at the tree, nothing is said to indicate that the serpent who appeared and spoke to her was a deity in his own right, who had been revered in the Levant, or the Middle East, for at least 7,000 years before the composition of the book of Genesis. Of course, many Christians have asked, where did this serpent first appear? How does he just happen to turn up? And who's this Lilith who just, happens to turn up? Why is there vague histories about all of this? Well, as Joseph Campbell is saying here, it's all much more ancient. It comes from ages past. Ariel Gutman and Kenneth Johnson in their book Mythic Astrology say, in the Near East, the primordial serpent is described as feminine, and we may suspect that in this region the myth did indeed become a metaphor for the conquest of matriarchy. But its universality suggests that there is yet a deeper psycho-spiritual meaning behind it. Gerald Massey in Egypt, The Light of the World, says, the Hebrews follow the Babylonians in confusing the uraeus serpent with the serpent of death. He says the retouching by the Greeks, like that of the Semites, tended to efface the figures or falsify the meaning of the mythos, and the astronomical facts are of 1,000-fold more important than all the petty embellishments of irresponsible fancy. But perhaps the worst perversion of the true mythos made by the Greeks was in their treatment of the polar dragon. So he's obviously showing us that not only was there a denigration of the female in later times, but almost running concurrently with that was the denigration, misinterpretation, and hybridization of the serpent symbol. Now we understand that these are not disconnected, because they were very connected in ancient times. The female and the serpent were twin motifs. You can't mess with one without the other. And always, even later days though, as much as the corruption was taking place, you still see the idea of the female being connected to the tree of life. Here we have Persephone with the pomegranate, but that's an ancient symbol going way back. In Egypt, the female is always associated with the tree of life. Nuth, of course, was the tree of life, not associated with it. She was the tree of life. That's where we get our English word nut, when nuts are given from the trees. It's also the idea of the ovums of the female, the goddess Nuth. Proverbs 3 appears to be talking about Mary, but is actually, of course, talking about something much more primal than that. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things thou canst desire are not to be compared unto her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold upon her, and happy is everyone that retaineth her. Wow, these are terms that you would think would be reserved for God or for Jesus. But here we've got all the goods in the hands of the goddess, the tree of life in the Bible. So isn't that a heavy piece of information, that the fruit, the forbidden fruit, might involve the female rights? We talked about the Jed pillar and the tree of life in Egypt, which was known as the Jed. And the Jedi, or the Jed, was the phallus of Osiris that needed to be replaced, but it was also considered the Kundalini, the energy of the natural energy of the body, which is also to be raised. Later on, as the Christians got hold of that idea of the tree of life, that had to be made now into the tree of good and evil. Again, the idea of splitting, the idea of creating duality. But we always see that the tree plays a central part in the Garden of Olives, or in the baptism scene, or the tree of Golgotha, in which Christ is crucified. And the Hindus had their tree of life as well. It's a primordial motif. The Scandinavians have their Yggdrasil. And we talked also about that if you have 4, you must have 5, because in transcending 4, you then represent yourself as the 5th element, which was known in Greek as epsilon, that's their 5th letter, sacred letter E, or the quintessence, the 5th essence. This is an important aspect. It's basically the same thing as the chemical wedding. And the symbol of that, or the mastery of the symbol of that, was the pentagram. That's why you'll often see the magician standing in his circle with the pentagram, or the magician will wear the symbol of the pentagram. This is nothing evil about it. The pentagram originally was associated with the 5 letters of the word hygiene, to represent those who have a pure mind or pure consciousness. And in the ceremonies of the 5th element, you would want to meditate on a 5-fold solid or a 5-fold image in order to reach that state. But one of the other most interesting and common symbols of the 5th essence was the dragon. The dragon whose claws gripped the earth, whose scales were like the fish in the sea, whose wings beat the air, the element air, and who breathed the fire, was nothing more than an image representing the unification of the 4. And those who could slay the dragon or ride the dragon, or who were permitted to speak to the dragon, were those who had again achieved that state of quintessence, the 5th element. So the slaying of the dragon and the releasing of the feminine were also connected, as you see here in the famous painting by Paolo Uccello. The idea being that slaying the dragon, and the dragon is passive here, peaceful. It's not an attacking dragon, it's just something that needs to be overcome, and overcome in the right way. Man goes through the labyrinth, which is his own consciousness, destroys the dragon there, and releases the feminine, or bonds with the feminine that is always chained. Because the dragon, when the dragon is unawakened, then it's the reptilian limbic side of ourselves. But as the alchemists knew, gold is not just created with a wave of a magic wand. Gold is created out of the lead, out of the negredo, out of the calcinatio state. So that which is lead becomes something higher, is transmuted in the same way that carbon becomes a diamond. So in the same way, as Lucifer fell, so he must rise again. If Lucifer falls by a lightning flash, then it is as a lightning flash that the Son of God goes home. This is a very important point. Jacob's ladder. The angels and the demons go up and down. So if the dragon that is the dragon of enlightenment, there must be a corresponding dragon of darkness or dragon of illusion. The pharaohs who wore the symbol of the serpent and the dragon on their forehead, as we said, the word literally meant enlightened mind. Those were those who had transmuted the dragon, who had ridden the dragon, who had conquered the mysteries. They were the members of the serpent cult who understood and kept this mystery from antiquity. The modern Judeo-Christian Vatican hegemony are those who hide it, sequester it, take it away from us, keep us in confusion, ruled by the lower dragon. And the last of, but not least of the great chapters of the book of symbolism and the book of the magical Western tradition is the subject of numerology, which, as the word implies, involves numbers, the science of number. But Carl Jung says that numbers are not concepts consciously invented by men for purposes of calculation. They are spontaneous and autonomous products of the unconscious, as are other archetypal symbols. Marie-Louise von Franz, who is a very close associate of Carl Jung, in her book The Process of Individuation, says that numbers thus appear to be a tangible connection between the spheres of matter and psyche. What they're talking about might be difficult for us to understand until we realize that we didn't invent numbers. You don't invent the numbers 1 to 9. Those numbers just exist because they themselves are repositories of higher symbolic energies. Something that's very elusive, rarefied, abstract, manifests itself down, and we understand it from this level as being the numbers. The numbers represent elements that are much more numinous. They're just concentrates and of all sorts of occult principles associated with them. Again, numerology is a very vast and interesting subject, but we can condense it quite a bit when we understand that central to the subject of numerology are the 3 kinds of time. There is, of course, clock time, which we're all familiar with. There is calendrical time, with which we're all familiar, the idea of the seasons and the 12 seasons we pass through. The 4 seasons, but the 12 signs of the zodiac, or the 12 months of the year. And then there's the third, which is much, much less known, and that is psychological time. Psychological time. Now, the first 2 we're veritable slaves of. We should be in absolutely no doubt that they exist. I mean, the watch on your hand has the 12 divisions. The calendar on your wall of the year has the 12 months of the year. But then we have psychological time. What's the clock to measure that? Well, the clock for measuring psychological time was nothing more than the zodiac. That's what the zodiac is. It is a clock for measuring psychological time. There's nothing mysterious about it. There's no hocus pocus. It is simply to be used, and the doctor would use a thermometer to take your temperature. Nothing more mysterious than that, unless somebody is willfully using divination to be malign, and there's no doubt that there are such people who do that. 12 months, 12 hours, 12 signs. Numerology is the art that specifically deals in how to get you in touch with your psychological time clock and your psychological rhythms, because there's also a very important map, a time map, what we call the personal timeline, that can assist you in becoming empowered in your daily life. And if you're out of touch with it, well, it's just like casting off your physical watch and saying, hey, I can live without my date book, I can live without my calendar, I can live without my watch for 2.5 weeks. See what chaos your physical life will be in trying to handle that scenario. Just do it, test it, See if you can do it even for a few days. Well, think of the consequences then when you've taken away your inner clock, as we've all done, and cast it away. Think of the consequences to the soul afloat on the ocean of karma and time and space. When we look at the number 1, for instance, we find that this has an origin. 1, we saw in astrotheology that the word on meant light in Egyptian, and 1 means the light. Of course, all number must come from the light or come from 1. But 1 also derives from the Vedic word yoni, or onai. And yoni is always known to be the symbol of the female regenerative power. So 1 literally is the birth of all other number, but it refers to the female. In astrology, the symbol for the sun, and the sun is always considered very masculine, of course, in astrology, it's the male symbol. But let's look at the symbol again. The symbol for the sun is this symbol. It's traditionally connected with masculinity and dominance. The traditional symbol of the sun is a circle with a point in it. However, it is of single interest that this is also the image of the female breast. We'll often see the sun god or the sun king Horus or Krishna sitting in the head of a bull, or he'll have the bull's headdress. Many times in Egypt you see the god standing on the top of the bull's head when you'll see the horns. However, what this relates to is again much more biological in nature. The ancients understood that the shape of a bull's face and the horns represented the fallopian tube complex of the uterus and the female generative opening, from which comes what? The child, the birth of a child. In fact, when they see the child or the sun, you'll often see even the sun disk in the middle of the horns of a cow or a bull. Same thing, the idea of giving birth. Birth comes from the fallopian complex of the female, and that seemed to look like, physically to them, the head and the horns of a bull. And the twisting process that is, they said, experienced subconsciously by the child as it makes its way out of the canal, the birth canals, that was the reason why labyrinths were often drawn in ancient times, and even why the Celts spent so much time with these interweaving zoomorphic shapes and with the little heads at the end. They'd have little human faces or heads at the end of these entwining labyrinthine drawings of theirs to represent this movement through the female. As today, well, the same reason why they say when you walk through a labyrinth, these earthwork labyrinths that they have made, if you walk on them, you have this uncanny sense of peace. Well, yes, because it's reminding you of something very peaceful and something very primal. In mythology and in religion, we have the motif of the 2 mothers of God, or the 2 Marys. Leonardo da Vinci was fascinated by that. We'll always see the 2 females at the foot of the cross. The 2 Marys, Martha and Miriam, Mary the mother of God, Mary Magdalene. We've got in the Old Testament Eve and Lilith. In Greek mythology we've got Demeter and Persephone. There's many, many examples of this. But again, the original duad is the sisters, the twin sisters in Egypt, Isis and Nephthys. There you see them standing behind the Pharaoh. In astrotheology, we always talked about how the male was an officiator or an ambassador or an agent for the feminine principle. That feminine principle is the feather of Mat that's above his head. He officiates for Mat. That means he's in perfect harmony and balance. He has the 4 suns in front of him. And then behind him stand the 2 goddesses who represent the 2 phases of the moon, the crescent moon. But they are known as Isis and Nephthys. There they are again, always behind the sun god, presiding over the events. And the headdress of Isis is a seat, S-E-A-T. She is the goddess of the east. And her sister Nephthys, who represented the dark crescent, was the goddess of the home and the hearth, but her headdress was of the tower. And now these sisters, as a duad, are known as the Reti. Eric Newman speaks of them in his book Origin and Evolution of Consciousness. He says the fact that the hero has 2 fathers or 2 mothers is a central feature in the canon of the hero myth. An archetypal mother figure appears beside the personal mother. So an archetypal mother and the stereotypical mother. The archetypal father and the stereotypical father. King Arthur is born of Uther, Pendragon, but he's taken by Merlin, and then he's given into the hands of Sir Kay, his twin, and into one of the other knights for safekeeping. Uriens, or whoever, I can't remember right now, but he's raised by another knight. All the mythological heroes have two fathers or two mothers. Just to understand where these principles come from. We move to the concept of threeness. Threeness is one of the most important archetypes. One important threefold division is our sense of time. We have past and present and future. Another concerns the three gunas, which give rise in humans to the various personality dispositions. The High Celts used the symbol of the triskelion, or three spirals, to represent the three main glands in the brain, the pineal, the pituitary, and the hypothalamus, which they believe controlled all other glands, hormones, and organs. Geometry. This triangle is one of the most important geometrical symbols in architecture and also in nature, the way things grow and the way things are designed and built. We even have whole cities designed based on the triangle. We haven't got time in this program to do an entire analysis of all the numbers associated with the goddess. You're dealing with thousands of years of mythology, and numbers like number 9 alone, just the study of the number 9 in relationship to the goddess, let alone 3 and the prime numbers and the triad numbers, would be a monumental task. Now, coming to the way of the goddess, we find that the ancients had several ways of personifying the goddess. The first emanation of the goddess's power was the physical female herself, obviously. Her body was in harmony with the movement of the celestial orbs. As Oswald Spengler, the historian, says, the reproduction of the species is feminine. It runs steadily and quietly through all species, animal or human, through all short-lived cultures. It is primary, unchanging, everlasting, maternal, plant-like, and cultureless. If we look back, we find that it is synonymous with life itself. So Spengler is talking about the direct relationship between life itself and the female. Upaleus, in his Golden Ass, says, I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all the elements, primordial child of time, sovereign of all things spiritual, queen of the dead, queen also of the immortals, the single manifestation of all gods and goddesses that are. I want you to please note for now just this term, queen of the dead. We're going to try to explain a little bit later what that means in relation to spiritual development, that there's two paths to spiritual development, and that the West has got out of sync because they only understand one phase of development, one mode of operation when it comes to spiritual development. J.J. Bachofen, one of the greatest scholars on the subject of the matriarchal cults of antiquity, says that woman exists everlasting, self-subsistent, immutable. Man, evolving, is subject to continual decay. In the realm of the physical, therefore, the masculine principle is of second rank, subordinate to the feminine. The earth being bountiful and resplendent was also seen as a perfect symbol for the goddess. So we have the ordinary physical female being a representative for the goddess. The next symbol of power that the ancients give was the earth itself. It was green, it was bountiful, it seemed to be eternal, and it was providing all your needs. George Russell, the Irish philosopher and member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, said that I believe that most of what was said of God was in reality said of that spirit whose body is earth. And Jane Ellison Harrison says, a worship of the powers of fertility, which includes all plant and animal life, is broad enough to be sound and healthy. But as man's attention centers more and more on his own humanity, such a worship is an obvious source of danger and disease. So she's not saying that focusing on humanity is a wrong thing. Again, it's all about balance. If you do it to the exception of focusing on the natural, then it becomes something that can be distorted. In the tarot cards, we often see the nature of the goddess in her connection to the elements, also in her connection to the serpent. J.J. Bachofen in Das Mütternacht, his book on the matriarchal cult, says the prime datum is the earth, the basic maternal substance. Visible creation proceeds from her womb and is only then that the sexes become divided into two. Only then does the masculine come into being. Thus the male and female do not appear simultaneously. They are not of the same order. The female is primary, the male is only what comes out of her. And thirdly, the goddess was symbolized by the night sky. It was considered her womb, the theater of the mysteries. In fact, it was considered probably the most important of the symbols of the female was the night sky because of all the phenomena that actually happens up there. According to Barbara Walker in her Woman's Encyclopedia of Myth and Legend, she was the world body, the primal abyss from which the sun first rose. She was the spirit behind the veil, whom no mortal could see face to face. An ocean infinite in extent and of fathomless depth, bearing the germ of all kinds of life. That's right, Nuth, the goddess of the night. All the stars and the planets were merely embryos or spermatozoon in her great womb. The Latin writer Plutarch, in a translation of an Egyptian passage on the goddess Neith, said, "I am all that has been and is and shall ever be, and my robe no mortal has yet uncovered." Lao Tzu, the Chinese Taoist, in his Tao Te Ching said, "There was something formless yet complete, that existed before heaven and earth, without sound, without substance, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven." In Occidental mythology, Joseph Campbell writes, "In the Neolithic village, the central figure of all mythology and worship was the bountiful goddess Earth, as the mother and nourisher of life and receiver of the dead for rebirth. However, in the temples even of the first of the higher civilizations, the great goddess of highest concern was certainly much more than that. She was already, as she is now in the Orient, a metaphysical symbol, the arch personification of the power of space, time, and matter, within whose bounds all beings arise and die, the substance of their bodies, configurator of their lives and thoughts, the receiver of their dead, and everything having form or name, including God, personified as good or evil, merciful or wrathful, was her child within her womb." Aleister Crowley underscores what Campbell is saying here in a passage. He quotes the quote is, "The female is to be regarded as having been separated from the male in order to reproduce the male in a superior form." Again, one of the ancient passages from the ancient world, from Egypt, Isis in her own words, "I am she that is the natural mother of all things, mistress and governess of all the elements, the initial progeny of worlds, chief of the powers divine, queen of all that are in hell, the original principle of them that dwell in heaven, manifested alone and under one form of all the gods and goddesses. At my will the planets of the sky, the wholesome minds, sea, and the lamentable silence of hell are disposed. My divinity is adored throughout the world in divers manners, in variable customs and by many names. And the Egyptians, which are excellent in all kinds of ancient doctrine, and by their proper ceremonies accustomed to worship me, do call me by my true name, Queen Isis." From the most ancient of days, we have the Venusian goddess and the concept of the mother. And through the art of the world, the tremendous emphasis of the female form and also the mysteries of the feminine, both in the sacred and profane way. Plato in his Timaeus says, "She presides over the whole of generation into natural existence, leads forth into light all natural reasons, and extends a prolific power from on high, even to the subterranean realms." I want to mention again that there's a lot of emphasis here on hell and the subterranean realm, the underworld. We'll be coming more to what that really means later on. Eric Newman says, "The archetypal feminine is not only a giver and protector of life, but as a container also holds fast and takes back. She is the goddess of life and death at once. The feminine contains opposites, and the world actually lives because it combines earth and heaven, night and day, death and life. The vessel character of the feminine not only shelters the unborn, but also takes back the dead into the vessel of death, the cave or coffin, the tomb or urn." We said earlier about how important that was to the ancient Celts and to the Egyptians to inter their dead warriors or the kings into the tomb or the mound that literally embodied the body of the goddess. In the Shakti Sangama Tantra, we read that woman is the creator of the universe is her form. Woman is the foundation of the world. She is the true form of the body. In woman is the form of all things, of all that lives and moves in the world. There is no jewel rarer than woman, no condition superior to that of woman. Now, we need to understand that not a lot of women are aware of this issue also. Just like men are a travesty of what masculinity represents, so many women have fallen from what these ancient texts are saying. We have a problem in the world. Neither being is manifesting what they really could be. Far from it. There's an initiation and an evolution required on both fronts here. As D. Hollander in his Tarot for Beginnings says, the high priestess uses her wisdom and understanding to enable others to find their own true path. The high priest uses his power to increase his authority over others. Now, of course, a lot of the problems started from Christianity, Judeo-Christianity, and from the book of Genesis. From the outset of the Bible, we have the denigration of the female and, as we're saying here, of the feminine. The book of Genesis and the temptation of Eve. Now, we find that the book of Genesis was originally known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which was also called the Book of Coming Forth by Day. But that book also went by the name of the Book of Gen Isis. And the word Gen meant queen or woman. It's a word that meaning the genes or generation of Isis. From the same root, we have so many words. Gen, Gen, means woman or queen in Anglo-Saxon, which gives Jen or Gwen, the girl's name Gwen, or Quinn, or Queen, or Gwyn, or Gwen in Welsh. We also get Gwen-Avere, meaning the white or fair woman or white queen. And of course, we understand that Guinevere is nothing more than a rescripting of the White Queen of Egypt, Isis, with Arthur being a rescripting of Osiris. Jinn, G-I-N, comes from it also, as done Gyne, Genes, Genius, Genie, the woman's name Jean, the term gentle, generosity, and gain. These are all terms that originate from that. In fact, when you said that this child is a real genius, what you were actually talking about was, yes, because it's the female genes that have passed on to him. Because the word genes, by the way, means the female. Alvin Boyd Kuhn says that it is quite exciting, incidentally, to know that the Genesis account of the creation of mankind through its first parentage in Adam and Eve bears the marks of derivation from the primary Egyptian symbolic depiction. Yes, because now at least we may have the chance of finding out the true meaning of the story and setting the problem to right. In Egypt, we have the primal parents. Adam and Eve is an old story. The original Adam and Eve were actually called Jeb and Nut. Jeb is the earth god, and Nut is the sky goddess, his consort. Now, the 16th card of the tarot is called the Tower Struck with Lightning. It has several meanings, but its imagery has also to do with the act of conception, which fascinated the ancients. That's right, the tower struck with lightning has many symbolism attached to it, but the idea of a phallic tower with the top of it blasting off was always understood as a symbol for orgasm and a symbol for conception on a deeper level. The Egyptians, of course, the designers of the tarot, are not people who are just interested in genital sexuality. These individuals understood the mystery of conception. And what a mystery it is. They thought to themselves, what is this mysterious thing that within a lightning flash of spiritual energy, something happens, and within the body of a female, from an ovum, comes a human form, comes a spiritual life in the cauldron that they knew as the womb of the mother. They thought this was unbelievable, how this incredible magical act took place. They understood that Nut is the tree of life, and in her womb are the ovums. And the ovums were always known in ancient times, though, as the apples. So in the book of Genesis story, when you read about the apple from the tree of life, we've already established that the tree of life is the ancient goddess. Well, then what are the fruits of the tree of life? Those are the ovum. But what's the fruit from the real tree of life? Is the apples. So when you read in the book of Genesis about temptation involving an apple, just understand that we have a story here that is based in the old tantric alchemist androgynous concept. Ova, ovum, are apples. And the serpent that comes in to bite the apple, or who tempts somebody to bite the apple, was always known in ancient times as a representation of the male sperm, the spermatozoon, which we know today under a microscope looks like a little wriggling serpent or a little wriggling snake. Well, you know, the whole question of how the ancients were able to see that and know that, I go into in my book on Atlantis, which deals in just how incredibly technically advanced the ancients were. But from purposes of this show, let's just keep it simple. The idea that the ovum was the apple that is bitten into slowly, gradually, by the sperm. That's how the head becomes bruised. And as the modern biologists know today, that when the sperm enters into the ova, the circle of the ova, when the sperm enters in, its head breaks off, or the tail snaps away. And in the tower struck with lightning, that's exactly what you see. The tower's head is being blasted off. Now this story, the original story of Genesis, comes of course from the old Palmyrians, the mystery school tradition in Egypt, where the tree of life and these mysteries were all taught in their original form. Here's a hieroglyphic that encapsulates what we're talking about here. You see the goddess Eve with the ova, with the apple, offering this mystery, this our secret mystery, to the male. Above them is the serpent and the ova. Above their head you see the cobra. In Egypt this was a common symbol, always showing the circle and the cobra, or the sperm and the ovum, the apple. But there was no concept of evil involving it in any of this at the time of the stellar cult. So here we see an act of initiation. The recumbent male, who's in a state of torpor, is being initiated by the female priestess, who represents the earth. On the right you see the tree of life, which is again fourfold. And you see the rapport, the interaction, that the male will gain his regency, his sovereignty, his kingship. He sits on the chair of the panther god. The panther, of course, represents enlightenment, the cult of the priests. So the whole actual scene is so much more languid and poetic and beautiful than the Christians, mythographers, turned it into. Genes, as we said, from the word for woman, same as genius, implies the female muse. The serpent, or the spirit, and imagination were always originally personified by female archetypes. The high priestess was the initiator of the great mysteries of old. And the second card of the tarot lets us know that, because it's the high priestess. Behind her is the tree of life, the half-cut pomegranates, which represent the seeds of the ovum, the keeper of the mysteries. So, biting the apple is a euphemism for the male sperm entering the ova. That's one of the reasons why bad children were referred to as rotten apples. And our letter Q, which is a round circle with a straight line, or sometimes a squiggly line going into the Q, also was a representation of that act. Of course, this act has magical properties that we're completely unaware of now. It's all a matter of biology and nothing too much to think about. We have no real understanding of the miracle of conception whatsoever, because everything has been trashed, everything's been perverted, everything's been dumbed down to a most mundane, degree. We're not infused anymore with the miracle of masculine and feminine and all that this implies. The alchemists knew this mystery and they call it Azoth. Azoth was mercury, the secret elixir. It's one of the reasons why AZT is also given as an elixir to cure AIDS. AZT is a very ancient term coming out of Egypt, which meant the elixir of life, the liquid of all life. But the symbol for it was a serpent and an egg, or a serpent surrounding a globe. Here you have the serpent and the globe. So every time you now see the cobra and the globe, you'll know what it means. So now we know what was. How did that change, and how do we get what we've got? It has to do with the rise of the solar cult. The rise of the solar cult. In the program in this series called Astrotheology and Sidereal Mythology, we go into the 4 cults. In fact, we go into the 7 cults, but the 4 of greatest power, and show how their power dynamics operated in the ancient world, how one supplanted the other, how they appropriated the mythologies, and how after a long period of time they all decided to join together, become the first conglomerate. setting about the control of not only trade routes, but the domination of the human mind. And how many of the royal families, royal dynasties, even media personalities are all descended from these cults of power, are bloodline connected to them, and have an agenda that they're working on, an agenda we need to rapidly find out about, because we're actually participating in it in an unconscious way. But briefly, we can sketch it out here again. Rainer Funk, editor of Love, Sex and Matriarchy. That's the book by Erich Fromm, says that we will never understand the psychology of either women or men as long as we fail to acknowledge that a state of war has existed between the sexes for approximately 6,000 years. 6,000 years ago, patriarchy triumphed over women, and society became organized on the basis of male domination. Women became the property of men and were obliged to be grateful to them for every concession. And I hope by now you take our point that we're trying to prove here that this is not a war that just happened to organically take place. This is not something that just happened willy-nilly one day. This is part of an orchestrated by design concept. Leonard Shlain says that we look back across the historical time of patriarchy, there seems to be some terrible inevitability, a relentless desire to crush the female essence. The question of why is one of the most puzzling of our time. These mainstream authors, even though they know the problem, are very hesitant to go the extra step and say, well, okay, this was by design and this was, a machination. And we can study that machination and do something about it. They resist that, and being purely intellectual, they'll just state the problem mostly and not go the extra distance to really remedy the problem. But we are in the 21st century now. The new paradigm is in town, solution think. And that might be uncomfortable in certain areas because we have to realize that there's been a campaign against the mind and the libido of the human being for many thousands of years. We don't just get into these problems overnight. Aleister Crowley, the Victorian magician, said that for some reason best known to themselves, the translators of the Bible have carefully crowded out of existence and smothered up every reference to the fact that deity is both masculine and feminine. They have translated a feminine plural by masculine singular in the case of the word Elohim. Now, phallocentricity is endorsed and reinforced not only in secular society but by almost all Orthodox religions and institutions that clearly seem more interested in politics and separation than in spirituality and integration. Christians would do well to ask themselves whether the loving Jesus would really have chastised Mary, saying that he came only from the Father and recognized no mother. One of the main fallacies of Occidental religions is that which espouses that man begins as a sinner and gets to the light by means of conversion involving any number of physical intermediaries. To the Gnostics and Sophics, this philosophy holds no currency. The Gnostics did not convert sinners, they awakened the ready. As Swala de Lubitsch, the great Egyptologist, said, the priesthood is always and will be always abusive. Now, Erich Fromm says the document that most powerfully exemplifies an extremely male patriarchal attitude is the Old Testament. It is not surprising that the subject of productiveness, the creation itself, also finds an extreme male solution in its pages. The reason why the Old Testament exhibits such a one-sided male character is that as the primary text of Jewish monotheism, it represents a male victory over female deities, over the matriarchal remnants in the social structures. The Old Testament is the triumphal hymn of the victorious male religion, a song of victory commemorating the destruction of all traces of the matriarchy in religion and society. Don't believe it? All you got to do is read it. Isaiah 1 says, bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with them. It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hateth. They are trouble unto me. I am weary to bear them. Come now and let us reason together, saith the Lord. In the Laws of Manu, which is an 8th century Vedic text, though destitute of virtue, or seeking pleasure elsewhere, or devoid of good qualities, a husband must be constantly worshipped as a god by a faithful wife. If a wife obeys her husband, she will for that reason alone be exalted in heaven. But of course we understand that the role of the female, the whole issue, goes back to masculine and feminine, yes, but it also goes back to the difference between being and doing. The mysteries of being were meant to be taught to man, or were meant to be kept by the feminine or the female, whereas man was more of the doer, or the masculine proclivity within us is more of the doer and the accomplisher. But there's also another ground of being, and that is being, which does not imply doing. Now, women were meant to be the keepers of this mystery. Being is connected to life and to space and to the feminine principle, whereas doing is more about lifestyle, time, and is also of the masculine modality. The loss of our ability to just be and our inflation of the ability to do has caused a lot of the world's problems. Erich Fromm says the detailed description of life of primitive hunters and food gatherers has shown that man, at least since he fully emerged 50,000 years ago, was most likely not the brutal, destructive, cruel being, and hence not the prototype of man the killer that we find in more developed stages of his evolution. So he's saying that the primitive man was more in connection with his being. He was a doer also, but he was in balance. He understood the mystery of being. And as a result, he was less violent and less troubled existentially. Marshall Solins says the world's most primitive people have few possessions, but they are not poor. Poverty is not a certain amount of goods, nor is it just a relation between means and ends. Above all, it is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status. As such, it is the invention of civilization. Leonard Slane says there were no religious wars in the ancient world before monotheism. Isn't that a heavy piece of information? So just in case you're interested in tracking the history of war and how that remarkable phenomena of our world comes about, just realize that it has a birthday: monotheism. Leonard Slane in Sex, Time and Power says culture is man's defense against nature. David Watson in his Pathology of Civilization says primal society had been called the original affluent society. Affluent because its needs are few. All its desires are easily met. Its toolkit is elegant and lightweight. Its outlook linguistically complex and conceptually profound, yet simple and accessible to all. Its culture is expansive and ecstatic. It is property-less and communal, egalitarian and cooperative. Like nature, it is essentially leaderless, neither patriarchal or matriarchal. It is anarchic, which is to say that no archon, no ruler, has built or occupied center stage. It is rather an organic constellation of persons, each unique. Primal society maintained its equilibrium and its egalitarianism because it refused power, refused property. Understood. He is emphasizing what we were talking about earlier on, that yes, of course, man had his duty to perform socially, but the whole thrust of ancient society was on the independent self. This has been blurred and obscured today. Man didn't want power. He refused it openly because it was a poison. He understood it to be the very thing that would stand in the way of him developing personally. Socrates said, to harm another is to harm oneself. He's not just talking about open violence, which any fool can see is not particularly pleasant. He's talking about moral violence. Did not Christ say that the thought of the sin is the sin? Mystically speaking, if it's in here, it's already done. It's already a done deal. The karma is already in action. But dharma is your authentic lifestyle. And dharma can't be when you're a power-hungry person whose sole meaning in life is dominating others, nor can dharma occur when you're the slave or the servant of others. So man is quite capable of taking care of his domestic and social duties in a more mechanical, easygoing way, and reserving then time so that he can deal with the greater purpose of his life, his meaning of life, why he's actually on this planet. In the Indian Sanskrit, that was known as the Dharma, the way of Dharma. Heidegger, the German philosopher, referred to it as das Ein, the true being, the true self. Gerald Massey, the Egyptians had no vicarious atonement, no imputed righteousness, no second-hand salvation. No initiate in the Osirian mysteries could possibly have rested his hope of reaching heaven on the Galilean line of glory. His was the more crucial way of a menta, to tread with the guidance of the Word that step by step and act by act he must himself make true. Now, Amenta is the underworld. Amenta is the shadow world. Amenta is looking at the dark aspects of your own psyche. You're not going to get anywhere towards any kind of light until you first understand that where there is a strong light, there's also a lot of dirt that shines up. And until you take care of that dirt, there can be no question of higher forces or angels or gods coming to talk to you. If your soul, your psyche, your heart is poisoned with dark emotions and upsets and frustrations and what have you, you can rule out any idea of anything spiritual coming into your being or you as descending to anything. So the Egyptians understood that there's a cycle here that involves, yes, a cultivation of spiritual powers and awareness, but there's something else also, the release of the negative that is within us. And we are ourselves our own path makers of that. Eric Newman said in his book On the Moon and Matriarchal Consciousness, the comparative passivity of matriarchal consciousness is not due to any incapacity for action, but rather to an awareness of subjection to a process in which it can do nothing, but can only let happen. It is an inner possession, realized and assimilated by the personality, but not easily discussed, for the inner experience behind it is scarcely capable of adequate verbal expression. For this reason, a plain and simple masculine consciousness finds the knowledge, quote-unquote, of matriarchal consciousness unverifiable, willful, and par excellence mystical, or mystic. That's right. We're back to the old idea of language being too limited. Language is very important for what it is to do, but there's another kind of communication, and therefore there's a whole slew of different experiences that you'll have to go through mystically, which cannot be in any way reduced, not even the finest poets, not even Ezra Pound or Rainer Maria Rilke or William Blake could put it into words. Leonard Shlain goes on to say, around 1500 BC, there were hundreds of goddess-based sects enveloping the Mediterranean basin. By the 5th century AD, they had almost been completely eradicated, by which time women were also prohibited from conducting a single major Western sacrament. Okay, so from being the keepers of the sacraments, the keepers of the mystery of being, to being a whole culture of matriarchs, we find a complete genocide taking place. The full answer to that is in my work on Atlantis. Right now we can only focus on some of the permutations of it. Theodore Roszak in The Voice of the Earth says, in Maria's Gimbutas's influential formulation, it was the Indo-European incursion of warlike Indo-European nomadic tribes, worshippers of the masculine sky gods, that replaced the matricentric cultures of old Europe with the androcratic warrior society that henceforth claimed all virtues of civilization for itself. But before that, there had been a civilization of the goddess marked by peace and high art. Under the spell of this original version of Gaia, there was even a different kind of city, one that honored the earth and rested lightly upon it. Lewis Mumford, the sociologist and thinker in America, said that out of the early Neolithic complex, a different kind of social organization arose, no longer democratic, that is, based on neighborly intimacy, customary usage and consent, but authoritarian, centrally directed, under the control of a dominant minority, no longer confined to a limited territory, but deliberately going out of bounds to seize raw materials and enslave helpless men, to exercise control and exact tribute. This new culture was dedicated not just to the enhancement of life, but to the expansion of collective power. By perfecting new instruments of coercion, the rulers of this society had, by the 3rd millennium BC, organized industrial and military power on a scale that was never to be surpassed until our time. And it's basically gone on unabated. In my work on Atlantis, alien visitation, genetic manipulation, we look into the original reason for this great expansion that had also a purpose that, again, we can't afford to go into in this program. But just a note of this incredible travesty. He's saying that this went on unabated and has moved in even to our time. The suppression of women, but this whole doing mentality and also this conquestative proclivity. Now, in my other work on the website and in the High Windows book, and also in the Tarot's major arcana, I say that regardless of the hyperbole of Genesis, it is man who comes from the body of the female. Woman does not emanate from him. He comes from within her form, but can never contain her form. As Aleister Crowley said, the female is to be regarded as having been separated from the male in order to reproduce the male in a superior form. This is a very enigmatic statement he's making there, a magical statement. People who are into sacred geometry, who understand the principles of sacred geometry, know about the Vesica Pisces and the circle, and how the line doth not beget the circle, but the circle begetteth the line. I also write that, moreover, men cannot understand why it is that after each and every peak experience, somatic and psychic, vitality wanes. It has long been a subliminal dilemma for the male that at the very moment of his greatest achievement or exertion, there comes the reciprocal diminution of his obviously finite energy. In short, the male has great fear concerning the ambient power of the feminine, and seeks to assert his own muscular and sexual strength in order to convince himself of his own potency. The rise of science is directly connected to man's relationship with the feminine and with women. In the days of old, man perceived that women alone gave birth. This act was not only an apparent miracle, but involved internal processes of which man knew little. The ritual also reinforced the symbiotic connection of the women of his tribe. Man eventually came to notice that the female biotic cycles were in synchronicity with the ordinances of heaven. It appeared to man that the gods had favored women. The gods gave life to the creation, and women, in their maternal capacity, gave birth to humans. They seemed, therefore, endowed with truly godlike abilities. Man felt their relative inferiority, psychologically and physiologically. This inferiority feeling, compounded by centuries of collective experience, became the motive for the effort by men to compete with women, to find some comparable power specifically to bring themselves into closer affiliation with the gods who seemed to have them on a lower rung of the ontological ladder. Men have succeeded in their subconscious rivalry. Their means of rivaling the magical, maternal endowments of the female, they call technology. And wow, have they been successful. This Frankensteinian drive, this horrendous Frankensteinian rivalry has been going on unabated since prior to the Industrial Revolution. And we look around now, we don't see it because it's invisible. It's so wall to wall that we never realize it until its worst effects come upon us, and then we have to do pickup. But how many are actually aware of the problem from its inception? I'm not saying we shouldn't have technology. Perhaps these things would have come about in a more beneficent way when the sexes were united. Who's to say? It's the fact that we have a dichotomy going on here, a suppression of one side of consciousness and the hyperinflation of another. That's the problem. Now, M. Esther Harding in Women's Mysteries says that the rise of the masculine power and of patriarchal society probably started when man began to accumulate personal as over against communal property, and found that his personal strength and prowess could increase his personal possessions. This change in secular power coincided with the rise of sun worship under a male priesthood. Sun worship was usually introduced and established by an edict of the military dictator, as happened in Babylon and Egypt, and probably other countries as well. Erich Fromm says the thought that the male can create living beings by himself, with his mouth, through his word, out of his spirit, is the most unnatural fantasy conceivable. It denies all experience, all reality, every natural condition. It disregards all the laws of nature in order to attain the one goal of presenting the male as the perfect being per se, who possesses the ability life appears to have denied him, the ability to give birth. And of course, the first act of creation is the birth of light, and light is always and everywhere a symbol of the male principle. In the beginning was the light. And I have to add also that if we take it that this drive for technology and science and gadget fixation that we have in the world, this whole mechanistic philosophy and applied science, is an aberration, is born from some psychotic rivalry in the mind of human beings, in the mind of men, then could it not be that by getting preoccupied in that, I mean, if its inception, if its root is already pathological, does that not mean that the role for which men were really put on this planet is not being worked on? I mean, if you're down that road, and that road is the false road, perhaps man is not attending to that which he should be attending to. And that could be one of the things that in the new millennium we need to be looking at. Because obviously, if it's not technology and science which is bringing the world to destruction, it must be something else. And we should be debating what that might be. What is it that is man's actual role? Are there secrets in the magical tradition? Is there secrets in Plotinus and in Aristotle? Is there secrets in the Gnostic canon? Is there secrets in the German existentialists and the German poets about man being the shepherd of being and being a temple unto himself? Or is it just homo vastans, man the destroyer, until the end? Leonard Shlain says that monotheism does not mirror human society. Humans are first and foremost social animals, a deity who is alone, not by choice but because there were no other companions for him, was a concept without parallel in human society. The God of the Israelites did not have a wife, a son, a daughter, or a mother. Eric Newman, in his Origin and Evolution of Consciousness, says the correlation of consciousness with masculinity culminates in the development of science, as an attempt by the masculine spirit to emancipate itself from the power of the unconscious. We call this path ascent, because we experience consciousness and the world of light as being above us, and the unconscious and darkness below, still under the spell of the primitive symbolism, which associates the upright posture of the human figure with the development of the head and the rest of the higher centers of consciousness. Joseph Campbell says that towards the close of the Bronze Age, and more strongly with the dawn of the Age of Iron, the old cosmology and mythologies of the Goddess Mother were radically transformed, reinterpreted, and in large measure even suppressed by those suddenly intrusive patriarchal warrior tribesmen whose traditions have come down to us chiefly in the Old and New Testaments and in the myths of Greece. Cyril of Alexandria, in his Mattheum, says, "The soul is more honorable than the substance of the body, seeing that it is God's image and inspiration. Still, the body is its instrument and its colleague in all that is best." Cyril is sort of on the twilight zone between the worst of two worlds. Yes, he understands that the body is necessary adjunct to the spirit, but he's almost giving in, as so many others would do, in which the next statement would be, no, the spirit is all important and the body is nothing. Well, of course, if you're already in such a schizoid state to be able to repress your own feminine and butcher women, and you're already in a state of compulsive rivalry, born out of no good reason, do you think that that kind of consciousness, that kind of psyche is then going to later create things that are actually sustainable and realistic? In the Kandamar Hosana Tantra, we read, "Therefore, one who desires Buddhahood should practice what is to be practiced. To renounce the sense objects is to torture oneself by asceticism. Don't do it. When you see form, look. Similarly, listen to sounds. Inhale scents. Taste delicious flavors. Feel textures. Use the objects of the five senses. You will quickly attain supreme Buddhahood." There we have it. The ancient world teaching us a completely different set of tenets and doctrines and dogmas than the aesthetic, morbid, sadomasochistic, passive-aggressive stuff that came later. We have a body, the schizoid mind can understand that the body is separate, needs to be suppressed. How distorted can you get? Here, the body is the oracle. It is the portal to the worlds, to enlightenment, in fact. What a new concept. Now, Richard Heinberg, in Was Civilization a Mistake? Says that in terms of health and quality of life, civilization has been a mitigated disaster. S. Boyd Eaton argued in the Paleolithic Prescription that pre-agricultural peoples enjoyed a generally healthy way of life, and that cancer, heart disease, diabetes, emphysema, hypertension, and sclerosis, which together lead to 75% of all mortality in industrial nations, are caused by our civilized lifestyles. In terms of diet and exercise, pre-agricultural lifestyles showed a clear superiority to those of agricultural and civilized peoples. Now, we're not blaming each other here. We didn't build the cities. We didn't create the civic states. We know it to be artificial, but somebody did. And in other work in this series, we go into who did and why this atrocious, hellish, utterly unnatural, inorganic, and ultimately lethal situation came about. Alvin Boyd Kuhn, in Ultimate Canon of Knowledge, says that it needs no dissertation to elaborate and certify what the record of history reveals as to this portent obsession with the dour religious consciousness over the centuries. It has left its lamentable record in the tale of corruption, banality, superstition, bigotry, and general moral and mental blight that overspread the areas of Christian Europe over the Middle Period, which has come to be known as the Dark Ages. David Watson, in The Pathology of Civilization, says, its name is progress, and the dream of progress continues to fuel global civilization's expansion everywhere, converting human beings into mechanized, self-obliterating puppets, nature into dead statuary. William Kotke, in his book The Final Empire, says, the civilized people believe that they have an obligation to bring primitive and underdeveloped people up to their level. Civilization, which is about to self-destruct, thinks of itself as the superior culture that has answers for all the world's people. The addict truly is a person who is emotionally dependent on things, television, substances, personality routines, other people, mental ideologies, total immersion in some cause or work. If the object of dependency is removed, then addicts will experience insecurity, discomfort, distress, the symptoms of withdrawal. As we pointed out in 2012, where history ends, we're going to be in severe cold turkey situation very soon because these things are going to be removed. They're already being removed. We have a death of the middle class on our hands. We've got economic upheaval on its way and worse. What are the withdrawal symptoms going to be like then? And what bromides and panaceas will be handed down to us by those wanting to stave off the worst? A whole new batch of mind control effects and phenomena on its way. As Aristotle said, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, and the one rules the other and the other is ruled. This principle of necessity extends to all mankind. Okay, there's no debate about it. They're just telling you that this is it, period. Leonard Schlein goes on to say that Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer and scientist, displaced Mother Earth from the center of the universe and replaced her with Father Son. Francis Bacon, in his Nouveau Organum, consistently used metaphors derived from the witch hunt and torture chamber to describe how scientists should force nature to relinquish her secrets. John Zerzan, in Elements of Refusal, talks of Descartes. He said, when Descartes enunciated the principle that the fullest exploitation of matter is the whole duty of man, our separation from nature was virtually complete, and the stage set for the coming of the Industrial Revolution. 350 years later, this spirit still lingers in the person of Jean Vorst, curator of France's Museum of Natural History, who pronounces that our species, because of intellect, can no longer recross a certain threshold of civilization and once again become part of the natural habitat. He further states, expressing perfectly the original and persevering imperialism of agriculture, as the earth in its primitive state is not adopted for our expansion, man must shackle it to fulfill human destiny. Theodore Roszak, the American ecologist and philosopher, in his book Where the Wasteland Ends, says, the astronautical image of man, and it is nothing but the quintessence of urban industrial society's pursuit of the wholly controlled, wholly artificial environment, amounts to a spiritual revolution. This is man as he has never lived before. It draws the line through human history that almost assumes the dimensions of an evolutionary turning point. So it has been identified by Teilhard de Chardin, who has given us the concept of the noosphere, a level of existence that is to be permanently dominated by human intellect and planning, to which our species must now adapt if it is to fulfill its destiny. But what's this fool talking about? We don't want nature. We want hang gliding and river rafting if we ever go out there. We don't want reality. We want virtual reality. We want computer games and skateboards and all sorts of interactive devices. We want TV. Why is this person saying we need to get back in touch with nature? We don't want any of that. We want cities and high rises and chrome towers going up and up and up. Now, Eric Fromm says the deep need of man not to feel lost and lonely in the world had, of course, been previously satisfied by the concept of a God who had created this world and was concerned with each and every creature. But for many of those for whom God was dethroned, the need for a godlike figure did not disappear. Some proclaimed a new God, evolution, and worshipped Darwin as his prophet. Well, that's right. Even though it worked for thousands of years, anything that has a beginning can probably fade out and have an ending. So even the God lie, has an end by date. And as it started to fade away, as that began to not work anymore and not give the ego its security and satisfaction, they had to come up with something new. So you just invent some other masculine horror and put it before the people, and they'll swallow it, they'll believe it. Anything but the real. Mark Matthew Braunstein says, where religion brought hate and called it the search for divine love, science brings death and calls it the quest for eternal life. Alvin Boyd Kuhn says that a study of Christian history discloses the portentous fact that the concept of the malignancy of matter coming into the movement from Hinduism through Zoroastrianism became an influence overwhelmingly dominating the theology and the ethic. It bred the monstrous cult of asceticism, whose driving motivation was the idea that the instincts of the flesh must be crushed down in the interests of the spirit. The tragic consequence of this staggering default of insight are incalculable, but in all conscience overwhelming to any intelligence that discerns it. It lay the Christian mind open to the obsession of a psychological influence that has been nothing less than devastating to sanity, inflicting upon the psyche a trauma that has produced morbidity and crushed to a degree the natural instinct for human happiness. Oh, you say, I'm no ascetic. I don't sit in any bed of nails and I don't deny myself nothing. Well, what's all those pills and medications in your cabinet? What's that 18 hours you spent sitting, 18 years you spent sitting behind a little cube, a little desk under the fluorescent lights in your school? What's that 9 or 10 hour day that you sit in front of some computer and some evil boss that you absolutely abhor? What's all that enslavement behind the wheel of a car from which you view everything that passes your window and you spend all in traffic? You're not a prisoner. These are forms of asceticism. As I said, it's so wall to wall we don't notice it. We don't even notice it, the clothes that we wear, how they imprison us, or how our duties and roles imposed upon us by the ones around us are a form of imprisonment. We don't notice that the grids and the blocks and the squares on which we live are the most uneconomical form of city design imaginable, which is already a form of imposed imprisonment. And these are only the obvious ones I can think of off the top of my head right now. The influence of a book, says Kuhn, has done nothing to mitigate the virulence of the Western religion's bias against nature. Its glorification of the person and function in history of the Son of God has in effect diverted all interest in the religious field away from man's relation to nature. And we must understand that the expulsion from Eden, it really can be read this way. It can be read as the loss of the symbiotic connection with nature and the universal order, the scission between the microcosm and the macrocosm, between psychic energy and physical energy. As Kuhn said, thinking which does not start from and continue in close relation to its foundations in the physical universe must lead to falsity. And this could be then one of the new paradigms that we need to inherit in the new millennium. Perhaps men should be involved in this, that if he's right, if the disconnect from nature created this penchant for falsity, then what can we do about it? We can observe it. We can find out how. We can be constructive. We can find out how our thinking is perverse. Let's make that our study. Let's discover objectively, in a Gestalt way, how our very thinking is anti-natural. Instead of prolonging it and looking for the answer with that kind of framework, because of course, that's how can you solve the problem with the same level of intelligence that brought the problem about? You have to do something different. So in other words, you continue what you're doing, but you observe how your thinking is pathological or psychotic. You make that the new philosophy of life. Sounds crazy now, but it's a lot better than carrying on the way we're going. And again, not only the suppression and the distancing from nature, but the absolute marginalization and condemnation of the female particularly. In Genesis 3, God is speaking. We're told he's speaking to the serpent, but we understand that when you're talking to the serpent, you're also talking to the female. Because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above all cattle and above every beast of the field. Upon thy belly thou wilt go, and dust shalt thou eat all the days of thy life. Now, in the book Atlantis and in the DVD we've done on Atlantis, alien visitation, and genetic manipulation, we go into the crime against the female and showing that just in the later historical era, where under the guise of Judeo-Christianity, there's a rising with the Dominican order, rising to persecute the witches. This is small potatoes. This is a very late in the day machination or attack on the feminine. The female, the hatred of the female and the war against the female goes back at least 13,000 years. And we talk about that in that other presentation. So what are the consequences of all this? Erich Fromm is happy to tell us. We have got ourselves into a state where our real difference from the animal is that we are the killer. Man differs from the animal by the fact that he is a killer. He, the only primate that kills and tortures members of his own species without any reason, either biological or economic, and who feels satisfaction in doing so. It is this biologically non-adaptive, non-phylogenetically programmed malignant aggression that constitutes the real problem and danger to man's existence as a species. He says the most ample and horrifying documentation for seemingly spontaneous forms of destructiveness are on the record of civilized history. The history of war is a report of ruthless and indiscriminate killing and torture, whose victims were men, women, and children. Many of these occurrences give the impression of orgies of destruction, in which neither conventional nor genuinely moral factors had any inhibitory effect. There is hardly a destructive act human imagination could think of that has not been acted out again and again. And of course, we all can point to that. We all know about that. We even know about that from our own lives. I certainly do, coming out of Northern Ireland. But you know that last line where he's talking about it all originating in the mind? That, to me, personally speaking, is a much more significant fact. I am more interested in the moral criminality, the moral and psychic violence that we perpetrate on each other every single moment of the day, as well as the ones that are more obvious in the world. This, to me, is important. I think it's also important for this new millennium that we start really being honest about this and looking into it, about the actual moral culpability before it becomes even physical. Because if we start dealing with that, perhaps we'll have a little bit less dying and murder in the world. George P. Marsh says that in his book, The Earth as Modified by Human Action, but man is everywhere a disturbing agent. Wherever he plants his foot, the harmonies of nature are turned to discords. Now, he said man there, but I always emphasize no. That's probably say masculine would be better, because women are capable of this kind of atrocity also. Erich Fromm says that in addition to sadism, the passion to destroy life and the attraction to all that is dead, that's necrophilia, seem to develop in new urban civilization. Michael Ellner says, just look at us. Everything is backwards. Everything is upside down. Doctors destroy health. Lawyers destroy justice. Universities destroy knowledge. Governments destroy freedom. The major media destroy information. And religion destroys spirituality. And here we have Alvin Boyd Kuhn, the great scholar, underscoring what I just talked about the nature of our interior self. One of the most virulent aberrations resulting from the cult of anti-nature has been the exhibition of near masochism throughout the history of religion. The reference is to the cult of asceticism. With the full sweep into Western Christian consciousness of the doctrine of the sinfulness of the flesh, there came the preachment of the evils of the world, the flesh and the devil, giving rise to the pratique of self-mortification and brutal suppression of all natural impulses. The spirit was all, and the flesh was evil, and the deadly enemy of the immortal soul. This aberration he's talking about, and all the others I mentioned a few minutes ago, come under the heading of cruelty to the self. Not only are we meant to notice how our thinking and our mental patternings are based on a unsubstantiated and unsustainable psychotic paradigm, but we're also meant to also notice at the same time how we perpetrate cruelty to the self. It becomes very obvious, isn't it, when cruelty is perpetrated to another. I mean, that's pretty obvious, and we can see that, and we can reprimand that, and we can do something about it. But I believe that there are myriad ways in which the human being is equally, if not more, cruel to himself. But we are not too privy in the ways in which that is done. Again, the idea of every time you have to take orders from somebody you dislike, every time you can't live up to your own self-image, every time you poison yourself with things that you know is wrong for you, every time you blame yourself a million times over in your head, over and over and over and over and over again, for what? A small misdemeanor that you made a long time ago in history. You kill yourself 10,000 times when the deed only happened once. Cruelty to the self. If you're already in that kind of state, how can you be benevolent? I mean, truly benevolent. You may put on a mask and play the game, but how can you really honestly be of service or humanity or help to another person? So it's very important in our life to discover how we're cruel to our own selves. J.A.C. Brown, in his book Techniques of Persuasion, says, thus the tendency of religions to suppress the natural expressions of the sexual drive would seem to indicate a subconscious awareness of the fact that when normal outlets are allowed, sublimation into religious feeling is less likely to occur. One cannot help but notice the predominant role played by unmarried women in the Christian churches, or the visible loss of enthusiasm for religious interests on the part of happily married women. Many have noticed the common use in devotional works of sexual symbolism and the tendency to express religious feeling in erotic imagery, even to the extent of describing what, in another context, would be taken as an account of sexual orgasm. Of course, he's perfectly right. Many scholars have gone into this. Many of the feminists know this. Many of the yogic teachers understand this. Wilhelm Reich spent his whole life pointing this out. And we can't underestimate that. Of course, we are sexually repressed. We're cut off from our libido. We're completely at odds with the natural energies and flows of the body. But again, that itself is only one symptom of a greater malady, the one I've been talking about. That imposition happens from suppression, but it also happens from repression. Repression is when you are cruel to yourself. Suppression is when something else, the mother or the father or the political state or the teachers or the apparatus is forcing you to operate and confine yourself and sequester yourself and obey. We understand that one. That needs to be fixed. But again, the issue begins with our repression. How are we our own tyrant? How are we our own malefactor? Caitlin Matthews, these Celtic scholar, she writes, our exile has not only been from the goddess, but also from nature. It is not surprising considering that most Westerners live apart from their environment, protected by concrete roadways, consuming machine-processed foods and filled with media information to the detriment of the experience of our own senses. The seasons go unnoticed. We seldom touch the earth, eat fresh food, or observe the world personally. The sacred is a forgotten dimension in our society, which we ignore at our peril. David Watson, in his Pathology of Civilization, puts it very, very eloquently. He says, we reproduce catastrophe because we ourselves are traumatized, both as a species and individually, beginning at birth. Because we are wounded, we have put up psychic defenses against reality and have become so cut off from direct participation in the multidimensional wilderness in which we were embedded that all we can do is to navigate our way cautiously through a humanly designed day-to-day substitute world of symbols, a world of dollars, minutes, numbers, images, and words that are constantly being manipulated to wring the most possible profit from every conceivable circumstance. The body and spirit both rebel. That is the case in point. For those of you who are students of philosophy, you can get into Jean Baudrillard, the French scholar who talked about the simulacra, that we don't want the real, or we're not given the real anymore, we're given simulacras. And almost everything in this world, especially that in the commercial ambiance, is a simulacra for a real. And we become distorted. And if you live, he says, in a world filled with these plastic copies, these objects. It's only a matter of time before you start yourself acting and feeling and becoming like a plastic simulacra, an object, an unreal thing. We even hear today of real TV. It's a contradiction in terms. What you're watching on a screen isn't real. It's not happening when you're watching it, and you're watching a bunch of electronic, phenomena. It's not real. Real is what is outside your window, what's right in front of you on the table and in the chair in which you're sitting. This is not real. And yet we're told it's real TV. Carl Jung, the great German psychologist, said that in his book Approaching the Unconscious, modern man does not understand how much his rationalism has put him at the mercy of the